The ship dropped through the orange clouds of HFY like a metal seed falling into alien soil. And inside that ship sat a girl who had never seen another world until 3 weeks ago. Her name was Mira-chan, and she was 19 years old with black hair cut short and hands that carried calluses from years of training in her father's boxing gym back on Earth. The planet below was home to the most famous structure in the known galaxy, a massive arena carved from black stone that had stood for 12,000 years while empires rose and fell around it. Every species in the galactic community knew about the arena of HFY because it was there that champions proved their worth, not with ships or bombs or technology, but with the weapons that nature had given them. That was the only rule of the arena, and it had never been broken in all those thousands of years. No artificial weapons were allowed inside the fighting pit, and champions had to battle, using only what evolution had placed upon their bodies. The Vorthax came with bone blades that grew from their forearms like curved swords made of calcium and keratin. The Solari came with spines full of venom that could stop a heart in seconds. The Kethrani came with skin that leaked acid, strong enough to melt through metal. And now the humans had come with nothing at all. Or so everyone believed when the ship landed and the delegation walked out onto the platform. A crowd of aliens had gathered to watch, and Myra could hear the sounds they made through her translator earpiece. Those sounds were not sounds of fear or respect or even curiosity. They were sounds of pity. The humans were new to the galactic stage, having only made contact with alien life 5 years ago. And in that time they had earned a reputation as clever builders and creative thinkers, but also as soft and fragile creatures from a gentle world. They had no claws, and no fangs, and no venom, and no armor. Their skin could be cut by a sharp rock, and their bones could be broken by a hard fall. What business did such beings have in the arena of HFY, where the deadliest warriors in the galaxy came to prove themselves? The delegation was met by the arena masters, tall creatures with gray skin and too many eyes who had managed the tournaments for generations. The senior master looked down at Mira with what she had learned to recognize as alien concern. "We are honored by the presence of humanity at our sacred games," the master said through the translator. "But we must ask if your species understands what participation means." Myra's commander, a military woman named Colonel Torres, stepped forward to answer. "We understand completely, Arena Master, and we have selected our champion according to your traditions." The Arena Master's many eyes all turned to look at Mira, who stood barely 5.5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 130 pounds. "This small one is your champion?" the master asked. "She is," Colonel Torres confirmed. There was a long silence, and then the arena master made a sound that the translator interpreted as gentle laughter. "We will not refuse your entry, as is your right as members of the galactic community, but we urge you to consider what you are doing." He gestured toward a massive screen that floated in the air nearby, and on that screen appeared images of past arena champions. Mira saw creatures with razor teeth and crushing claws and bodies built like living tanks, and she saw what those creatures had done to their opponents in the fighting pit. "The Tournament of Ascension is not a game," the arena master continued, "and the beings who compete here have spent their entire lives preparing their bodies for combat." He looked at Mira again, and this time there was something almost like sadness in his voice. "Your species was not designed for this kind of fighting, and there is no shame in withdrawing before the lots are drawn." Myra felt the eyes of every alien in the crowd upon her, felt their pity and their certainty that she would die. And something hot and stubborn woke up in her chest. She stepped forward before Colonel Torres could speak. "I have a question." "Arena Master." The gray creature tilted his head with surprise, because champions rarely spoke directly to the masters. before the tournament began. You may ask, your rule says no artificial weapons, and that means we can only fight with what our bodies naturally possess. That is correct. Myra held up her hands, turning them so everyone could see, and they were small hands compared to the massive claws and blades of the other species. But they were covered with thick calluses and old scars. On my world, we have spent 10,000 years learning how to make these into weapons. And we have built entire systems of combat around the idea that any part of the body can be trained to hurt or to kill. She made a fist, and the aliens nearby leaned back even though they did not understand why such a small gesture would matter. I have trained since I was 6 years old, and I have been hit more times than I can count. And I have learned that getting knocked down means nothing as long as you get back up. The arena master studied her for a long moment. You believe your training can overcome natural weapons that evolution spent millions of years perfecting? Mira smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. I believe that humans were never given natural weapons because we were meant to create our own. And what we have created is something your galaxy has never seen. The lots were drawn that evening in a great ceremony that was broadcast across 100 worlds. And when Myra's name was called, the crowd went silent with anticipation. Her first opponent would be Grathkal the Splitter, a Vorthax warrior who had won 43 matches in the arena and killed every single one of his opponents with the bone size that grew from his arms when his image appeared on the screen, standing 7 feet tall with blades that gleamed under the lights. The sounds of pity from the crowd grew even louder, but Myra just looked at the image and memorized every detail of the creature she would face. The way his weight shifted, the angle of his blades, the spots where his armor looked thinner, and somewhere deep inside her mind, she began to build a plan that night in her quarters. She wrapped her hands the way her father had taught her, layer by layer of cloth that would protect her knuckles when they hit something hard. And she thought about everything humanity had survived: ice ages that had frozen the world, plagues that had killed millions, predators that had been bigger and stronger and faster. And through all of it, humans had kept going. They had kept getting up, whatever waited for her in that arena. She would face it the same way her ancestors had faced every threat. Since the beginning of time, she would adapt, and she would endure, and she would refuse to stop until either she won or her body simply gave out. That was what it meant to be human, and tomorrow, she would show the galaxy exactly what that meant. The arena floor was made of sand mixed with mineral dust from a dozen different worlds, and it had been soaked with the blood of thousands of warriors over the centuries. Mira stood at one end of the oval fighting pit with her hands wrapped and her feet bare against the ground, feeling the texture of the sand beneath her toes and letting her body settle into a familiar stance. At the other end of the arena, a massive gate made of black metal began to rise, and from the darkness beyond came Grathkal the Splitter, the Vorthax warrior. Was even larger in person than he had appeared on the screen, standing over 7 feet tall, with a body covered in hard plates of natural armor that overlapped like the scales of some ancient dragon. But the most terrifying thing about him was not his size or his armor. It was the bone size that grew from his forearms. Curved blades almost 3 feet long that gleamed with a sharp edge that could cut through steel. The crowd of 50,000 aliens made sounds of excitement as the champion entered the arena, and their translator devices picked up words like death and blood and slaughter. Nobody was cheering for Myra. The arena master's voice echoed across the fighting pit, through speakers hidden in the walls. The rules are simple and have not changed in 12,000 years. No artificial weapons may be used inside this arena, and the match continues until one fighter cannot continue or surrenders. Grathkal made a sound that the translator rendered as cruel laughter. The soft one will surrender before I even touch her, he said. and his voice was like rocks grinding together. "But I will not accept her surrender because I want to show the galaxy what happens to prey that forgets its place." Mira said nothing in response because her father had taught her that talking was for before and after a fight, not during. And she was already in fighting mode. The horn sounded and the match began. Grathkal charged immediately because that was how Vorthax fought, using their speed and power to end matches in the first exchange before their opponents could react. He crossed the distance between them in just a few seconds. His bone sides raised for a killing strike that would cut Mira in half from shoulder to hip. But when the blades came down, she was not there. Mira had spent 40,000 hours of her life learning exactly how the human body could move, how far it could stretch and twist and dodge in a fraction of a second. And she had learned that the key to fighting a bigger opponent was simple. Do not be where they expect you to be. She slipped to the left as the scythes cut through empty air, and in the same motion she drove her right fist into a spot just below his secondary shoulder, where her briefing had told her a major nerve cluster was located. The impact traveled through her arm and she felt the shock of hitting something hard. But she had hit harder things in training, and her fist did not break. Grathkal screamed. The arena went completely silent because no one had ever heard a Vorthax warrior scream before. They were supposed to be immune to pain, their nervous systems designed to ignore damage so they could keep fighting. But no one had ever hit that particular nerve cluster with that much focused force. Mira did not stop to celebrate or to let the moment sink in because stopping in a fight meant death. She moved again, circling to keep herself outside the range of his size while staying close enough to strike. And her next punch caught him in the back of the knee where the armor plates did not quite meet. His leg buckled and he dropped to one knee. And now she was above him. The crowd began to make sounds that the translator could not interpret because they had no words for what they were seeing. This small, soft creature with no natural weapons was taking the part a champion of the arena, like she was dismantling a machine, finding the weak points and exploiting them with surgical precision. Grathkal swung his signs wildly, trying to catch her with a lucky strike, but Mira was always moving, always circling, and every time he left an opening she punished him for it. Her fist targeted the nerve clusters and joint connections that the human scientist had identified from studying Vorthax anatomy. Her elbows struck the thin spots in his armor where blood vessels ran close to the surface. Her knees drove into the soft tissue of his midsection when he bent forward in pain. She was bleeding too because even a glancing blow from those bone sides was enough to open her skin, and the sand beneath her feet was turning red. But the human girl did not slow down, and she did not stop. That was the thing about humans that the galaxy had not yet learned. The thing that made them different from every other species that had evolved on kinder worlds. Humans had been built by a planet that was trying to kill them, and they had learned to keep fighting through pain that would have stopped any other creature. Grathkal finally collapsed face down in the sand after what felt like forever, but was actually only 8 minutes. Mira stood over him, with blood running from cuts on her arms and one long gash across her forehead. Her wrapped hands stained red with a mixture of her blood and his. The arena master's voice echoed through the silence. "The match is decided, and the winner is the human champion Mira Chen." For a long moment nobody moved and nobody spoke. Then, slowly, the crowd began to make sounds again. And this time, the translator picked up different words like impossible and how and what did we just see. Mira walked back toward her gait on legs that wanted to shake but did not, because she would not show weakness in front of these aliens who had expected her to die. The medical team met her in the tunnel and started treating her wounds. And the head doctor, an alien with 4 arms and gentle eyes, looked at her injuries with something like amazement. "You should not have been able to continue fighting with these cuts," the doctor said. "And the pain must have been extreme." Myra thought about all the times she had been knocked down in the gym back home. All the times she had tasted her own blood and gotten back up anyway. All the years of learning that pain was just information and not a command. "Humans have a saying," she told the doctor as he worked on her wounds. "And it goes like this. Pain is temporary, but glory is forever." The doctor tilted his head in confusion. "That does not seem logical." Myra smiled despite the sting of the medical treatment. "No," she agreed. "But it is very human." Back in the arena masters were reviewing the footage of the fight from every possible angle, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. They had seen the human girl hit the Vorthax champion with her bare hands, and they had seen those hits do real damage to a warrior that most weapons could not hurt. "How is this possible?" one of the masters asked. The senior master watched the footage again, seeing the way the human moved and struck with precision that seemed almost unnatural. "The humans did not evolve natural weapons," he said slowly. "So they learned to turn their entire bodies into weapons instead." He paused the footage on an image of Myra's fist connecting with Grathkal's nerve cluster. "We may have made a serious mistake in allowing them to compete. But it was too late to change the rules now. The tournament of ascension would continue. And the human girl who fought with bare hands had only just begun." By her fourth victory in the arena, the whispers had spread to every viewing station in the sector, carried by travelers and merchants and diplomats who could not stop talking about what they had seen. The human girl who fought with closed fists. The human girl who bled with every fight but kept standing. The human girl whose body broke and healed. And broke again. Her second opponent had been a Solari named Vexthorn, a serpentine creature covered in spines that dripped with venom. Powerful enough to stop a heart in seconds, the arena masters had expected this match to end quickly because there was no way for the human to attack without touching those deadly spines. But Myra had spent the night before studying Solari anatomy with the human scientists who traveled with the delegation, and she had learned something that changed everything. The venom sacs that fed the spines were located on the Solari's back, and if those sacs were ruptured, the creature would be temporarily paralyzed by its own poison. So she had danced around Vexthorn for nearly 20 minutes, letting the Solari exhaust itself trying to catch her. And when the creature finally made a mistake and lunged too far forward, Myra had jumped onto its back and driven both elbows into the feisty venom sacs with all her weight behind them. The Solari had collapsed in a pool of its own venom while Myra rolled away with burns on her arms from the few spines she had touched. Her third opponent had been even more dangerous. A Kethrani whose entire body secreted acid strong enough to eat through metal in seconds. Nobody could touch a Kethrani in combat because anyone who tried would lose their hands or worse. But Myra had noticed something when she watched recordings of Kethrani fights. Their eyes did not produce acid because the acid would have destroyed their own ability to see. So she had torn strips from her fighting clothes and wrapped them around her hands, creating a thin barrier that would give her maybe 1 or 2 seconds of protection before the acid ate through. Then she had charged directly at the Kethrani while it was still preparing for a cautious defensive fight, and she had driven her wrapped fists into both of its eyes before it could react. The Kethrani had thrashed and screamed as it went blind, and Myra had danced away with the cloth falling from her hands in smoking pieces, her skin red and blistered but intact. Match had ended when the Kethrani surrendered because it could not fight what it could not see. Her fourth opponent had been a creature called a Thornback, whose body was covered in hard spikes that it could launch like projectiles. And that fight had left her with 3 spikes embedded in her left arm and 1 in her thigh. But she had won anyway, by closing the distance so fast that the thornback could not aim properly. And then she had found the soft spot between its shoulder plates and hit it until it stopped moving. Now she sat in the medical bay while the doctors removed the spikes and treated her wounds. And she listened to the broadcast that was playing on the screen above her bed. The human phenomenon continues at the arena of Kethphora, the alien announcer was saying, where a young female of the species has now won 4 consecutive matches against opponents that many believed were unbeatable. The screen showed footage of her fights, cut together to show the most dramatic moments. And Mira watched herself move and strike and bleed and keep fighting. Galactic analysts are struggling to explain how a species with no natural weapons can compete at this level. The announcer continued, and there are calls from several delegations to review the arena rules. The senior arena master appeared on screen, his many eyes looking tired and troubled. We have reviewed every match multiple times, he said, and we can find no rule violations of any kind, because the human is fighting only with her natural body and with techniques that her species has developed over thousands of years. He paused and looked directly at the camera. The truth that we must accept is that the humans have found a way to make themselves into weapons through nothing but practice and determination. And this was something we did not anticipate when we wrote the rules. The broadcast cut to reactions from around the galaxy, and Mira heard voices filled with fear and wonder, and something that sounded almost like hope. If the humans can do this, one alien was saying, then maybe the natural order is not as fixed as we thought. They are changing everything. Another voice added, and the old powers do not like it. The doctor finished treating her wounds and looked at her with those gentle forearm gestures that she had come to recognize as concern. Your body is accumulating damage faster than it can heal, the doctor said. And if you continue fighting at this pace, you may cause permanent harm to yourself. Mira flexed her bandaged hands and felt a familiar ache of bones that had been stressed almost to breaking. How long until my next match? She asked. 3 days. But I strongly recommend that you withdraw and let your body recover. Myra thought about the broadcasts she had been watching, about the species around the galaxy who had never had a champion before because they were considered too weak, about the message that her victories were sending to everyone who had ever been told they were not strong enough. I'm not going to withdraw, she said. The doctor made a sound of frustration. You humans are impossible to understand because you keep doing things that will hurt you as if the pain does not matter. Mira smiled despite the ache in her arms and legs and everywhere else. Pain always matters, she told the doctor. But so do other things, and sometimes those other things matter more. That night she received a visitor in her quarters. A small alien from a species she did not recognize who moved with nervous energy and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I am Trull of the Ven people, the alien said, and I have come to thank you on behalf of my entire species. Myra gestured for the alien to sit because standing was still uncomfortable. Thank me for what? For showing us that we do not have to accept our place at the bottom of the hierarchy, Trull said. And there were tears in his small eyes that looked surprisingly similar to human tears. Because we have watched your fights and we have seen what is possible when someone refuses to believe that they are weak. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched Myra's bandaged fist. The Ven have been servants and slaves for 1,000 generations because we have no natural weapons and no way to defend ourselves. But now we are asking ourselves, what if we could learn to fight like you? Mira felt something shift in her chest. A weight that she had not known she was carrying suddenly becoming lighter. On my world, she said softly, we have a tradition of teaching anyone who wants to learn how to defend themselves. And we believe that the ability to fight back is a right that belongs to everyone. Trull's eyes went wide. You would teach us? When this tournament is over, Myra promised, I will make sure that humanity shares everything we know about turning weakness into strength. After Trull left, Mira stood at the window of her quarters and looked out at the alien city spread below her, full of species that had accepted their place in hierarchy. Based on natural weapons and physical power, she thought about Earth and about all the centuries of human history, about slaves who had risen up and oppressed, people who had fought back, and anyone who had ever been told that they were too weak to change their circumstances. The arena of Cathvora was 12,000 years old, and it had always reinforced the idea that some species were born to rule and others were born to serve. But Myra was starting to realize that she was not just fighting for humanity anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told that nature had made them less than someone else, and she was not going to stop until that message was heard across the entire galaxy. The Tournament of Ascension had lasted for 3 weeks and had begun with over 100 champions from across the galaxy. But now only 2 fighters remained. One of them was Myra Chun, the human girl who had shocked the galaxy by defeating opponent after opponent with nothing but her bare hands and her refusal to stay down. The other was Vermaketh the Undying, supreme champion of the hegemony and the most feared warrior in the arena for 300 years. Myra had watched recordings of Vermaketh's fights so many times that she had memorized every movement, every pattern, every slight hesitation before a strike, and what she had learned terrified her. Vermaketh was a titanid, a species that had evolved on a world with crushing gravity, where only the strongest and toughest creatures could survive. He stood over 15 feet tall and weighed more than a small vehicle, his body covered in layered muscle and bone so dense that no natural weapon had ever been able to pierce it. His arms were like tree trunks, and his fists were like boulders. And when he hit something, it broke. In 300 years of fighting in the arena, Vermaketh had never been defeated and had never even been seriously injured. The warriors who faced him did not lose. They were destroyed the night before the final match. Mira sat alone in her quarters and looked at her hands, covered in scars and bandages from all the fights she had survived. She flexed her fingers and felt the ache in her bones, the accumulated damage from weeks of combat that had pushed her body to its absolute limits. For the first time since the tournament began, she allowed herself to feel afraid. Colonel Torres came to see her with a group of diplomats who represented the human delegation, and their faces were grim with the weight of what tomorrow would mean. If you win, Colonel Torres said, humanity will gain a permanent seat on the Galactic Council, and we will be recognized as a major power in the galaxy. She paused, and her eyes were filled with something that looked like guilt. If you lose, our species will be marked as prey, as soft, weak creatures that can be exploited and dominated by anyone who wants to. The diplomats nodded in agreement, and one of them added what everyone was thinking. The hegemony has made it clear that they will not be kind to humanity if their champion defeats ours. Mira looked at all of them, these people who had put the future of her entire species on her shoulders, and she did not feel anger. She felt tired. Do you know what my father used to tell me before my fights back on Earth? She asked. The diplomats shook their heads. He used to say that the only fight you can truly lose is the one where you give up before it is over. She stood up even though her legs ached and her body screamed at her to rest. Tomorrow I'm going to walk into that arena and face a creature that is bigger and stronger and tougher than anything I have ever fought. She began wrapping her hands, layer by layer, the ritual that connected her to every fight she had ever survived. I cannot promise that I will win because that would be a lie. But I can promise that I will not stop fighting until my body physically cannot continue. Colonel Torres nodded slowly. Is there anything we can do to help you prepare? Myra finished wrapping her hands and looked out the window at the arena that loomed over the city like a monument to violence. Tell me everything you know about Titanid anatomy. Every weakness, every vulnerability, every spot where they might be even slightly less invulnerable than everywhere else. The scientists worked through the night, analyzing data and running simulations and trying to find some advantage that Mara could use. What they found was not encouraging. Titanid bodies had almost no weak points because millions of years of evolution on a brutal world had eliminated every vulnerability. Their skin was too thick to be damaged by punches. Their bones were too dense to be broken by any impact a human could generate. And their internal organs were protected by layers of muscle that acted like natural armor. But there was one small possibility. Titanids had poor endurance because they had never needed it on their homeworld. No fight lasted more than a few minutes because either the Titanid won quickly or retreated to fight another day. No prey had ever survived long enough to make endurance matter. So the Titanids had never evolved to fight for extended periods. Their bodies generate enormous amounts of heat when they exert themselves, the lead scientist explained. And after about 30 minutes of continuous combat, they begin to overheat and slow down. Myra absorbed this information and felt something that might have been hope. So if I can survive for 30 minutes, he will start getting weaker. The scientist nodded, but his expression was doubtful. The problem is that no one has ever survived 30 minutes against the Titanid, and most matches end in the first 5. Myra thought about the training she had done back on Earth. The endless hours of cardio and sparring and pushing her body past every limit it thought it had. She thought about the ancient humans who had hunted by chasing their prey across miles of savanna until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. Persistence hunting, it was called. And it was the most terrifying adaptation in the history of Earth. Humans were not the fastest animals or the strongest or the toughest, but they could keep going longer than almost anything else alive. They could run and fight and work until their opponents simply gave up. On Earth, Myra said quietly, my ancestors used to hunt by following animals for hours and hours until the animals could not run anymore. She looked at the scientists with eyes that had seen too many fights to be afraid anymore. We called it running them to death. The scientist tilted his head. You think you can do that to a Titanid? Myra did not answer because she honestly did not. No, but she knew that she was going to try that night. She did not sleep because she could not afford to waste any energy on rest when she needed every bit of it for tomorrow. Instead, she sat in the darkness and thought about everyone who was counting on her. She thought about the other humans back on Earth who did not even know that their future depended on a fight happening light years away. She thought about Trell and the Ven people and all the other species who had been inspired by her victories. She thought about her father and the gym where she had learned to fight and the simple lesson that had guided her entire life: get knocked down 7 times, stand up 8. Tomorrow she would either change the galaxy or die trying. And when the sun rose over Kethvora and the arena opened its gates for the final match, Mira Chen walked out onto the sand with her wrapped hand raised and her heart beating steady in her chest, because she was human and humans did not know how to quit. The arena was filled beyond its capacity with over 100,000 aliens crowded into every seat and standing in every aisle. And billions more watched from viewing stations across the galaxy. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The final match of the Tournament of Ascension between the unstoppable champion and the impossible challenger. Vermagath, the Undying, stood at one end of the arena like a mountain that had decided to walk, his massive body casting a shadow that stretched across the sand toward where Myra waited. He looked at her with eyes that had seen 300 years of victories, and that saw nothing in this small human except another easy kill. Little creature, he rumbled in a voice that made the sand vibrate beneath Myra's feet. I have crushed warriors 10 times your size, and I have broken champions who thought they were strong. He raised his massive fists and the crowd roared with anticipation. "What do you think you can do against me?" Mira did not answer because talking would waste energy, and she needed every bit of energy she had. The horn sounded and the match began. Vermaketh charged like an avalanche rolling down a mountain, his footsteps shaking the arena floor, and when his fist came down, it was like a meteor falling from the sky. Mira threw herself to the side and felt the impact through the ground. As his fist cratered the sand where she had been standing, if that had connected, it would have killed her instantly. She rolled back too, her feet encircled away while he turned to face her, moving constantly so that he could not predict where she would be. His second swing came faster than the first, and this time she could not dodge completely. The edge of his fist caught her shoulder and sent her spinning through the air, and she hit the ground hard enough to drive all the breath from her lungs. The crowd made sounds of excitement because this was what they had expected, the small human being destroyed by the supreme champion. But Mira pushed herself up from the sand on shaking arms. She stood up. Vermaketh made a sound of surprise, because most opponents did not get up after being hit like that. He came at her again, slower this time, more careful, and his attacks were measured strikes designed to catch her no matter which way she dodged. She took another hit to the ribs and felt something crack, and the pain was like fire spreading through her chest. She went down. She stood up. The pattern continued for what felt like forever. Vermaketh hitting her with blows that would have killed any other creature in the tournament, and Mira going down and getting back up every single time. Blood was running from cuts on her face and her arms and her legs, and the sand beneath her feet was turning red with it. But she kept moving. She kept getting up. The crowd grew quiet as the minutes passed because they had never seen anything like this before. They had seen death in the arena, and they had seen surrender, and they had seen quick victories, but they had never seen someone simply refuse to stop. 15 minutes passed, and Vermaketh was starting to breathe harder. 20 minutes passed, and his movements were becoming slower. 25 minutes passed, and there was something new in his eyes, something that looked almost like confusion, because the tiny human was still standing. Her body was broken in ways that the medical scanners would later catalog with disbelief: fractured ribs and a dislocated shoulder, and cuts that went down to the bone, and bruises that covered almost every inch of her skin. But Mira Chun kept circling and kept dodging, and kept refusing to fall down and stay down, and every time Vermaketh left an opening, no matter how small, she hit him. Her punches were not strong enough to hurt him through his thick skin and dense muscle. But she was not trying to hurt him. She was trying to make him work. Every punch forced him to react, to move, to generate heat that his body could not dissipate fast enough. Every dodge made him chase her, using energy that his species had never evolved to sustain. This was persistence hunting, the ancient human technique that had allowed soft, weak creatures to take down animals 5 times their size. You did not need to be stronger than your prey. You just needed to outlast it at the 30-minute mark. Vermaketh stumbled for the first time in 300 years. His massive legs had started to shake, and his arms were moving like they were made of stone, and his breathing had become ragged gasps that echoed across the silent arena. Mira saw the opening and she took it. She ran at him with the last of her strength, and she jumped, driving her knee into the soft tissue around his eyes, where the nerve clusters were most sensitive. The blow would have been nothing to him at the start of the fight, but now, exhausted and overheated and confused, it rocked him backward. She hit him again, her fist targeting the same spots over and over. Nerve clusters and joint connections, and anywhere that damage could accumulate death by 1,000 cuts. Or in this case, death by 1,000 punches. Vermaketh swung at her wildly, but his movements were slow now. So slow that she could see them coming from a mile away. She dodged and hit and dodged and hit, her body running on nothing but willpower and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat at the 45-minute mark. The supreme champion of the hegemony, the warrior who had been undefeated for 3 centuries, fell to his knees at the 50-minute mark. He collapsed face down in the sand and did not get up. The arena was completely silent for a long moment. Then Mira Chun, standing over the fallen giant on legs that were broken in 3 places, but somehow still holding her weight, raised her ruined hands above her head, and the crowd erupted in a sound that the translators could not interpret because no word existed for what they were feeling. The arena master approached on shaking legs and looked at Myra with all of his many eyes filled with something that might have been awe. "Champion," he said, and his voice carried across the arena to every corner. "Name your weapon so that it may be recorded for eternity." Myra looked down at her hands. Those small, soft human hands that had been told they were useless and weak and not designed for combat. Those hands that had learned to become weapons through nothing but practice and pain, and the refusal to accept limits. Those hands that had just changed the history of the galaxy. "The weapon," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard it, "is called human." The arena master bowed his head. "Let it be recorded in the eternal archives that on this day, a human champion won the tournament of ascension with nothing but her bare hands and the spirit that would not break." In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted. Humanity gained their seat on the Galactic Council, and the hegemony was forced to accept them as equals. But more importantly, the story of Mira Chun spread to every world and every species that had ever been told they were too weak to matter. Training centers began to open across the galaxy, places where anyone could learn the human way of fighting, the ancient techniques that turned weakness into strength. And Mira herself, once her body had finally healed, kept the promise she had made to Trell and the Ven people. She traveled from world to world, teaching anyone who wanted to learn, showing them that the weapon they needed had been inside them all along, because the true lesson of the arena was not that humans were special or superior. It was that any species could become more than what evolution had made them, if they were willing to work and suffer and refuse to give up. That was the human way, and now it belonged to everyone.